Number one frustration dealing with sounds on the drum set, overtones, right? I hate them. You hate them. We all hate them. We're spending tons of time trying to get rid of them, trying to mitigate them, trying to figure out how to manage all this nonsense that's coming out of these instruments every time we're hitting them. But what if, it's possible that they're actually the most important tool we have to define our drum sound. Instead of talking a lot about this, we're going to start with listening to something. Let's have a listen to this tom in this snare basket. Now, this sounds like a drum, obviously, but the fundamental is choked pretty severely by the snare stand. Now let's go a step further and put a high-pass filter on this drum so that we are actually only hearing the overtones. So suffice to say, it doesn't really sound much like a drum anymore. Let's go the other way. We're going to install True Vibe isolation mounts on the snare stand so that this tom can have the fullness of sound injected back into it. What we have now is a balance. We have the fundamental frequency, we have all the overtones present, and that combination is telling us with our ears that this is a tom. And that's basically what we're looking for when we talk about fundamentals and overtones working together. They are what define each of these drums as being what they are. Now let's step back from this single drum and hear the entire kit, but we're going to hear it in a groove context with everything you're hearing reduced to just the fundamental frequency, no overtones at all. All right, we've done it. We've gotten rid of all of the overtones. We've succeeded in having none at all. And obviously, this is an extreme. This is not really the sound of drums anymore. But, we need to be thinking also in terms of the fact that we want this fundamental. It's not that there's anything wrong with that either. It's that balance, that combination, everything working together to tell us what each of these instruments are. What this means for us is that we need to start understanding that each of these instruments lives on a frequency spectrum. There's some crossover between the toms and the bass drum and all of that, but there's parts of these sounds that live in what we would consider to be the overtones that are super important. Things like attack and snare wire sound, articulation. The idea that we can scoop out overtones to achieve some better sound, it's more complicated than that. We are managing overtones and trying to achieve, again, a balance between the fundamental, the overtones, and also what parts of the overtones are giving us things that we need. Big thanks to TNR Products for sponsoring today's episode and for providing us with the True Vibe isolation mounts that we're using to demonstrate overtones and fundamentals with our rack tom today. When working with a drum and thinking about things like muffling and overtones, I want to start with as much sound as that drum can possibly produce, and the True Vibe isolation mounts are the quickest way to get everything out of that drum that it can possibly offer me. As much as these mounts provide us with more sustain, for us it's really more about the overall resonance and projection of the complete sound of the drum to microphones and audience, and generally to just give us a better time playing them. TNR has devised these mounts for installing onto a snare stand for snare drums or rack toms, things like that, as well as these for floor-mounted toms. Let's hear this rack tom without the True Vibe mounts, and then we'll install them so you can get a good idea of the effect they're having. As always, there is no EQ, compression, or any other post-production on this sound. This is just the raw sound of this drum. The proof is in the sound. You can't get around it. It sounds infinitely better with a little bit of suspension underneath. It gives us fundamental, it balances the overtones, it gives us the purest, biggest, fullest, roundest sound that this drum could possibly produce. No matter whether you're planning to go wide open or experiment with muffling or any other unorthodox techniques, these are going to give you the most fundamental, the biggest projection, and the largest sound out of that drum, which again is more to work with as you start to manipulate and balance it out for the sound you're looking for. Follow the link below to learn about everything that TNR has to offer across all the span of isolation mounts for all of your drums. You're going to be happy you did. Now, a prime example of a thing that happened organically because of movements in music that is overtone specific is the 90s, the detuning of guitars, this sort of like battle for control of the low end in heavy music. As it got thicker and heavier and lower tuned, bass drum starts to get lost. How do we get the bass drum to be clear and articulate and part of what we're hearing in this music if the low end where it's supposed to live is completely taken up? The answer to lifting the kick drum out of that mud so we can hear all of that fast double bass and all of that interesting syncopation that was happening was to put high end, overtone, back into it, whether it's patches on there or samples or just extreme EQing in general way up in the multiple Ks. These are the things that someone had to look at as they were mixing it and go, okay, we need a window for this drum to speak through, and there's no room down where its fundamental is. So we got to go way up into the higher portions of the overtones of a bass drum and give it some clicky attack so that it's present in the overall mix while still having some thunder underneath, obviously. But, you know, we want to know it's there, especially if you're playing that many notes. Now, similarly, there's another very common thing that needs high end to achieve its job, which is to dictate time, much like the bass drum. Metronome. If you have a metronome that is living in the very low frequencies, you're going to struggle to be able to utilize that to dictate time to yourself or anybody else that's trying to listen to it. Just as the hi-hat closed can be the one thing that's happening on stage when the rest of the kit is not being played, just to give everybody something to hold on to and play together, we need things in this high frequency spectrum basically to communicate the articulation and the clarity of the kit no matter which part of it we're playing. Now, beyond tactile things like articulation and snare sound, we should also address that overtones are what define, for instance, a metal snare drum from a wood snare drum, or a snare drum from a tom, or a bass drum from a bass guitar. It's things that are in the same frequency range, but there's a confluence of other things knocking around in there that take it from being one instrument to being another instrument. And every single part of those is important, especially if we're considering selecting an instrument or considering selecting even a tuning for a certain song that we're working on or for a gig that we're going to do. When we talk about something like a snare drum, this range of sounds from the fundamental on up, when we're talking about body, articulation, snare wire sound, crispness, fatness, any of these things, they are all existing across this frequency spectrum, and there's no one little spot that is any one of these things. And we need all of them to not just define it as a snare drum, but to define it as my snare drum, or your snare drum, or the right one for whatever music you're making. What this all boils down to is that the balance we were talking about at the beginning is not just about overtones and fundamental, it's a complete balance over the instrument that gets us to the sound that we're looking for. And we're going to dive into this further in future videos about what parts of the frequency spectrum are giving us what parts of the sound and how to manipulate those things and adjust them to get the balance that's right for you. But the bottom line is, we're not trying to kill overtones, destroy them, get rid of them, whatever word you want to use. It's not about that. It's about taking everything that this instrument is giving us and molding it gently, hopefully, to get us to the sound that we're looking for so that we're happy when we hit it, so that it sits in the mix the way we need, and so that we can stay excited about whatever music we're making. right, thanks so much for coming along on this journey with us as we're testing out this new format for the upcoming season. And thanks so much to TNR Products for sponsoring today's episode and providing us with these True Vibe isolation mounts so we could really dive into that fundamental, because that's what they do best. Visit the link in the description below to learn about everything that they have to offer and go after that fundamental.